Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Before coming to the Israel Policy Forum, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute. Dr. Koplow holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University, where he specialized in political development and ideology and the politics of Middle Eastern states. He writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. In addition to his PhD, he holds a BA from Brandeis University, a JD from New York University, and an AM in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. So with great pleasure, I'm happy to turn the session over to Dr. Koplow and Andrew, whose topic tonight is the most recent Israeli elections. What happened? What comes next? Michael, welcome back to Beth Shalom. The session is yours.
Thank you, Eric, and great to be with everybody.
So, Michael, the last time you joined us was March, was it 2021? I think it was a year ago, a little more than
A year ago, yeah.
And a lot has happened since then. I'll do a quick summary, then I'll let you take it away. Tell me anything I got wrong, which is the recent Israeli elections returned Benjamin Netanyahu to the driver's seat for the third time since the 1880s. He's been able to cobble together a coalition that has been called the most right-wing in Israeli history. It's going to include this is as of 5 minutes ago, so it might have changed since then. It will include 3 far-right, 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, making Likud the most left-wing partner of the coalition. His probable partners include the far-right religious Zionism party leader, and it's what's his name? Bezalel Smotrich, who's pushed for a heavier hand in controlling the Israeli policies in the West Bank. We have the extremist Otzma Yehudit chief Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is due, I believe, to lead a new national security ministry that will be given authority over border police in the West Bank. And then last but not least, far-right MK Avi Maoz, whose No One Party campaigned on a frankly homophobic and anti-pluralistic platform. So I'll turn it over to you to make sense of all this. Tell me what I missed and what's the single most important thing we need to know about this probable Israeli government.
Thanks, Andy. So you didn't miss anything. Let me just fill in some of the details in between the lines. So I think for starters, it's important to understand how we arrived at this prospective coalition of 64 seats out of the 120 seats in the Knesset, because it appears to be a pretty clear win for the Netanyahu bloc, comprised of those parties that you outlined. But when you look at the actual election results, one of the things that is interesting, and it's something that will be familiar to us as Americans, because we know here that the popular vote does not always translate into the person who becomes president based on the Electoral College. We actually had something similar this time in Israel, where you have these 2 well-established blocs that have been running now in these 5 elections in 3.5 years. And you have a group of parties that is part of the Netanyahu bloc, and those are the parties that you just mentioned in your introduction. And then everybody else is in the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And if you add up the votes for the parties in the Netanyahu bloc versus the votes for the parties in the anti-Netanyahu bloc, in this election, the 5th election, the anti-Netanyahu bloc actually got about 30,000 votes more than the Netanyahu bloc. And yet, despite that, we have 64 seats for the Netanyahu bloc and 56 seats for the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And the reason that happened is really a story about organization. So there are some quirks to Israeli election law, much like we have in the United States. And one of the quirks is that to make the Knesset, any party has to get 3.25% of the vote. That's the Knesset threshold. If you get 3.25% of the vote, that automatically entitles the party to 4 seats in the Knesset. And then obviously the more votes you get, the more seats you get. And so it's very important that parties all make that threshold. Now, something that Netanyahu is very good at doing is making sure that the parties in his camp are united. And before the election, he made sure that a bunch of small parties united together to run as single larger parties. So the parties that are in this Netanyahu coalition, if you count them up, it's Likud, Shas, UTJ, and then the three far right parties that you outlined, that adds up to 6 parties. Although those 6 are actually 7 parties, and they ran as 4 parties because the 3 far right parties, Religious Zionism, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam, all ran together as one technical block under the heading of Religious Zionism. And so that block of 3 parties got 14 seats, despite the fact that one of the parties got 7, one of the parties got 6, and one of the parties got 1. Getting 1 seat, by the way, is impossible to do if you're running on your own. And of the ultra-Orthodox parties, UTJ, which received 7 seats, is actually 2 parties, Agudat Yisrael and Degel HaTorah. And so together they got 7 seats. Had they run separately, one or both of them may have fallen below the threshold. And so Netanyahu made sure that these parties all ran together and there were going to be no wasted votes. On the other side, on the anti-Netanyahu side, you had the opposite phenomenon happen, where there were 2 sets of parties that would have benefited from merging together and did not. One set are the 2 parties of the Israeli left, I should say the Jewish Israeli left, Labor and Meretz. Labor and Meretz were both polling right around the threshold before the election. Prime Minister Yair Lapid tried to broker a merger between them, and Meretz was in favor of merging, but Labor was not. And what happened was that Labor made the threshold, but Meretz missed it by just a few thousand votes. And so every single vote for Meretz, and they ended up with 3.2% of the vote, so they really just missed it. Every single vote for Meretz got thrown out, didn't count. The same thing happened with the Arab parties. There are 4 Arab parties that challenged for the Knesset, Chadash, Ta'al, Ram, and Balad. Those 4 parties across the previous 4 elections, twice they ran as one party, as the joint list, and twice they split up into 2 groups. In this election, for the first time in this 5-election cycle, the 4 parties ran not as 1 and not as 2, but as 3. And what that meant was that there was no way that all of them were going to make the threshold. And in fact, one of them, Balad, did not make the threshold. And so what you have on the anti-Netanyahu side is that about 285,000 votes that should have been on that side of the political aisle got thrown out just from these 2 parties, Meretz and Balad, that did not make the Knesset threshold. And so we have what looks like a pretty sizable win for the Netanyahu bloc, but in reality, the Israeli vote was split pretty evenly, and as I outlined, actually went a bit more toward the anti-Netanyahu side. So that's how we got to where we are. Now, irrespective of what the votes were, the Knesset is 64-56, and that means that Netanyahu is going to form a government with these now 6 parties. And so what might we expect to see going forward? So there's a pretty good way of divining this, which is that these parties all have to sign coalition agreements with Likud as the largest party in order to form a coalition. And these agreements are now in the process of being signed, and they generally telegraph what we're likely to see. And there are a few issues that are really coming to the fore. The first is something that is called judicial reform, which is a big catch-all category for a number of different things that are important for different reasons to the right-wing parties in Israel. There's a long-standing complaint among the Israeli right that the Israeli judiciary, really 2 complaints. One is that the Israeli judiciary is perceived to be left-leaning. And so the mirror image of what we have here in the United States, where many folks on the left, certainly today, perceive the Supreme Court to be stacked to the right. In Israel, the longstanding complaint is that the Supreme Court is stacked to the left. And this impedes some of the things that right-wing parties want to do. Secondly, there's a longstanding complaint on the Israeli right, which is related to this first complaint, which is that the Supreme Court is perceived by many Israelis to be a non-democratic, or I should say undemocratic institution, because the people of Israel elect the Knesset, and the Supreme Court is an appointed body. Not only is it an appointed body, unlike here in the United States, where an elected politician, the president, nominates Supreme Court officials, and more elected politicians, senators, decide whether a Supreme Court justice is going to actually be confirmed to the Supreme Court. In Israel, you have a selection committee for the Supreme Court that is actually comprised mostly of sitting Supreme Court justices and members of the Israeli Bar Association. And so on the Israeli right, a common complaint is that the Knesset is a democratic body selected by the people, and it's hampered by this undemocratic body that gets to dictate to the Knesset what is legal and what is not, and prevents the Knesset from undertaking things that the popularly democratically elected legislature of Israel wants to do. And so for a long time on the Israeli right, there has been a call to have a Supreme Court override bill passed, which would allow the Knesset to override Supreme Court decisions. So when the Knesset passes a law and the Supreme Court now says that law violates one of Israel's basic laws, Israel doesn't have a constitution, so I'm loath to use the term unconstitutional. Israel instead has a set of basic laws that effectively serve as a constitution. When the Knesset passes a law that the Supreme Court says has to be struck down because it conflicts with one of Israel's basic laws, at the moment, there's no recourse. The Supreme Court has the final say. What the parties in this coalition want to do is pass a Supreme Court override bill, so that if the Supreme Court overturns Knesset legislation, the Knesset would then, by a majority vote, get to override that Supreme Court decision and pass the legislation that they would like to pass, irrespective of what the Supreme Court says. This is important to many of the parties on the right philosophically, but it's also important for some very specific reasons. The ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel, Shas and UTJ, have long sought exemptions for ultra-Orthodox Haredi Israelis to serve in the IDF. And the Supreme Court has consistently ruled that ultra-Orthodox members of Israeli society, ultra-Orthodox citizens, can't get a blanket exemption. And so for the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and UTJ, it's important to them to pass a Supreme Court override bill so that the Knesset can then finally, for good, exempt ultra-Orthodox from serving in the IDF. For the more right-wing nationalist parties, particularly religious Zionism, Otzma Yehudit, and to a certain extent Likud, the reason a Supreme Court override bill is important is because of the West Bank. The Israeli Supreme Court has ruled on multiple occasions that settlements cannot be established on private Palestinian land in the West Bank. And this is something that that has long bothered some of the parties on the right, and particularly religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit. And so their main interest in a Supreme Court override is so that they can pass laws that will effectively allow settlements anywhere in Area C, whether it's state land or private Palestinian land, and the Supreme Court will then not be able to declare that illegal and have that barred as a course of action. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who to a lesser extent is interested in these things, is also interested in judicial reform. In his case, judicial reform means getting rid of his trials. Right now, I should say his counts. Right now, he's on trial for three different things, three different counts. And in all three of those counts, he's on trial for fraud and breach of trust, which is effectively the crime that Israeli politicians get charged with in matters of corruption. In one of these cases, he's also on trial for bribery. And one of the things that he wants to do is to either pass something called the French law, which would bar sitting Israeli prime ministers from being investigated and indicted while they are still prime minister. Or one of the other things that's being discussed is to eliminate fraud and breach of trust as crimes in the Israeli penal code, in which case 2 out of his 3 trials would immediately go away, because in two of his 3 indictments rather would immediately go away, because in 2 of these, the sole charges are fraud and breach of trust. So he would like this as well. And in order to do that, he almost certainly will have to get around the Supreme Court, which is also unlikely to let those sort of things go through. So this is number 1 on the agenda, and this is something that really unites all the parties. The second thing that I think we can expect to see from this prospective coalition has to do with the West Bank, not in the context of judicial reform. This coalition, not the ultra-Orthodox parties as much, but Likud and certainly religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit, want to fundamentally change the status of the West Bank. People may recall that in the late 2019 and early 2020, there was a lot of talk in the Israeli political sphere about either applying sovereignty to the West Bank or annexing the West Bank. This happened also in conjunction with the release of the Trump plan in January 2020, which envisioned upfront 30% of the West Bank being annexed to Israel. And then there were supposed to be negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization over a potential Palestinian state. And if those negotiations didn't work, then under the Trump plan, Israel would be free to annex whatever part of the West Bank it wanted to annex beyond that initial 30%. This all got shelved in the summer of 2020 for the Abraham Accords, when the Emirati ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, wrote an op-ed in Yediot Achronot, the second largest Israeli newspaper, where he said to Israelis, you can have normalization with the UAE, or you can have annexation, but you can't have both of these things at the same time. Israelis overwhelmingly wanted normalization versus West Bank annexation. Normalization is popular with pretty much all Israelis, whereas West Bank annexation really garners support of probably between 10 and 15% of Israeli Jews. And so this annexation plan was dropped. This time around, with these parties in the new coalition, annexation is back, but it's back in a different way, because the parties in this coalition, and particularly Bezalel Smotrich, who Andy mentioned in his introduction, is a particularly smart and savvy politician. And what he understands is that if you talk about annexation or application of sovereignty on day one, you're likely to run into some of the same problems that happened last time: opposition from the United States, opposition potentially from other countries in the region. And so the way they're going about it now is by instituting a plan where things will go piecemeal. And in the beginning, many of these things look like administrative shifts rather than a fundamental change in the West Bank's status. But what they will all add up to is effectively annexation. And so the things that they're talking about that are in these coalition agreements from day one, for starters, there is a plan to legalize illegal Israeli outposts. And when I say illegal, I mean illegal under Israeli law. There are 127 settlements in the West Bank that are legal under Israeli law. They're recognized by the state of Israel. And they're legal under Israeli law because they have been built on what is called state land inside of the West Bank, and because they've gone through the planning and permitting process where everything has been approved by the Israeli government. So when we talk about settlements, that's largely what we're talking about. In addition to these 127 legal settlements, there are about 205 illegal Israeli outposts and illegal Israeli farms. And again, when I say illegal, I mean under Israeli law in the West Bank that contain somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 Israelis living in them. And what makes them illegal under Israeli law is that they were all built without any type of Israeli government approval. So they haven't gone through the permitting and planning process. And in many of these cases, they're also built on private Palestinian land, which, as I mentioned earlier, is something that the Israeli Supreme Court has said cannot happen. The first part of this plan that the coalition has is to legalize retroactively these illegal outposts and say, from now on, these are legal settlements. And so the coalition agreement that has already been signed between Likud and Religious Zionism, Bezalel Smotrich's party, calls for, within 60 days of the formation of the government, the state paying for water and electricity to these illegal outposts. I should note, by the way, that if you've ever visited these places, you'll know that there already is water and electricity to these illegal outposts, but it's paid for by the regional settlement councils. This would have water and electricity paid for by the Israeli government. And then within a year to retroactively legalize all of that. That's step number one. Step number two has to do with the legal settlements inside the West Bank. There is a body called the Civil Administration, which is the body that is in charge of all construction for both Israelis and Palestinians in Area C. Area C is the 60% of the West Bank that is controlled entirely by Israel. And all Israelis who live in the West Bank, it's about 480,000 to 490,000 of them live in Area C. And there are also about 300,000 Palestinians living in Area C. For either Israelis or Palestinians, if you live in Area C, the Civil Administration, which is a body that's part of the Defense Ministry, is in charge of all construction, all approvals, and all demolitions. And as part of the agreement between Likud and religious Zionism, Bezalel Smotrich is going to be appointed as a junior minister in the defense ministry. So he's not going to be the defense minister. He's actually going to be the finance minister, but he will, in addition to that, be a junior minister in the defense ministry. And what he will control in the defense ministry is the civil administration. So he will be in charge of all settlement construction in the West Bank. He will also be in charge of demolitions in the West Bank, which means that he will have the power to decide whether illegal outposts are demolished. He'll also have the power to decide whether Palestinians can build in Area C, and whether Palestinian structures in Area C that were built without a permit can be demolished. And so this will almost certainly increase at a very rapid rate the pace of settlement construction inside the West Bank. Just to put things in perspective, under the Netanyahu governments, the previous 12 years under Prime Minister Netanyahu, generally the body that the civil administration controls, that it's called the Supreme Planning Committee, that plans West Bank settlement construction, would meet about 4 times a year. Under the Bennett Lapid government, I believe it only met twice. Bezalel Smotrich has said in the past that he would like to convene it every single month. So the pace of settlement construction is almost certainly going to grow at a pretty rapid pace. The last thing I'll mention from this government has to do with Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir is the head of Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish supremacist party that now has 6 seats in the Knesset. Itamar Ben-Gvir, as part of his negotiations with Netanyahu, is going to be appointed to a new position known as the National Security Minister. The National Security Minister currently exists as what's called the Public Security Minister, but they've increased its powers and renamed it. The Public Security Minister is in charge of the Israeli police. The reason that they've renamed it National Security Minister is that they've also given this new ministry control over the West Bank border police, so the police that operate outside of recognized Israel, the police that operate in the West Bank. And they're also giving this minister power over the police that normally belongs to the police commissioner. And so Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I should note has 7 criminal convictions on his record, including one for support of a terrorist organization and incitement to racism, is going to be the minister who's in charge of the police. And he'll be in charge of the police not only inside of Israel, but he'll be in charge of the police who operate in the West Bank. And he will also be in charge of the police who operate on the Temple Mount. And this is important because Itamar Ben-Gvir is one of the figures in Israel who has talked a lot about changing the status quo on the Temple Mount. The status quo on the Temple Mount since 1967 has been that Muslims pray and non-Muslims visit. The Temple Mount is obviously a very sensitive spot. I'd argue it's probably the most sensitive spot in the entire world, but it's certainly the most sensitive spot anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, which is why Israeli governments, including very right-wing governments, have not changed the status quo, certainly not formally. Itamar Ben-Gvir has talked about changing the status quo. He's also talked about increasing his own visits to the Temple Mount. And he's also talked about changing the rules of engagement for Israeli police, whereby they would be allowed to shoot anybody on sight, for instance, who's holding a stone or holding a Molotov cocktail. Right now, the current rules of engagement are that people like that can only be shot if they present an imminent and serious threat to a soldier or police. Itamar Ben-Gvir has talked about his desire to change the rules of engagement, something that will be entirely within his purview to do for the police as national security minister. And so, that is certainly going to have an effect in some way, shape, or form on relations between Israelis and Palestinians, and likely on the types of clashes we've seen in and around Jerusalem over the past few years. I could go on and on about other changes we're likely to see, but I want to make sure that we get to more of Andy's questions and other questions people have. But those are some of the things kind of to be keeping an eye on that I think we're likely to see in the first few months ahead.
Thank you for that. I want to ask a quick, this is obviously, I'll put it this, this is very good news for folks who want to solidify Israeli control in the West Bank. It's not such good news for people who support more autonomy for the Palestinians and certainly the two-state solution. I think I can include the Israel Policy Forum in the latter camp.
Yes.
So you've written, I want to hear your thoughts on what you've called kind of the best case scenarios and the worst case scenarios. And I think a lot of this depends on where Netanyahu fits in and how much authority he will wield and what direction he'll take it. So what are some of those, best case scenarios and worst case scenarios?
So the best case scenario from my perspective, and when I say best case scenario, I mean in terms of keeping the current status quo in the West Bank relatively unchanged, because I think that the sort of far off best case scenario where you'd actually have an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians is nowhere. It's not any conceivable future. I think the best case scenario that is reasonable under the current configuration would be that Netanyahu understands. Listen, this is somebody who has served as Israeli prime minister longer than anybody else in the history of the state of Israel. He has more experience than anybody else dealing with the United States. He's also the person who was prime minister of Israel when the Abraham Accords came into being. That is an accomplishment that is rightfully his. And so he understands, I think, Israel's place in the international system, and he understands how issues inside the West Bank can and cannot impact Israel's foreign relations. The best case scenario, I think, is one in which Netanyahu, who understands these factors and who I should also say has a long history of being very cautious as prime minister. He's not a prime minister that uses force very often. He's not a prime minister under whom Israel has fought any major wars. He's not a prime minister under whom Israel has undertaken any major military operations outside of Gaza. I think that it's not unreasonable to think that his history of relative caution isn't just going to go away. And that means doing things to make sure that the fundamental situation in the West Bank doesn't get overturned. Interestingly, part of this agreement that Smotrich signed between Likud and religious Zionism, in which Smotrich is a junior minister in the defense ministry overseeing the civil administration, is that everything has to be approved by him, but then Netanyahu also has the final say. And so, I think that there will be mechanisms, should he so choose, for Netanyahu to slow some things down. He is operating in a political context in which his voters for the other parties in his coalition do expect some real radical changes. And so, I think there's only so much, even if he's inclined to slow things down, that he'll be able to do. But he is an experienced operator, and I think that there is a situation in which he lets things proceed at an increased pace, but doesn't do anything to really fundamentally alter the status of the West Bank. I also think that there's lots of evidence to suggest that the increase in seats for religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit, who controlled 6 seats in the outgoing Knesset and saw that jump to 14, lots of evidence to suggest that many of their voters voted for them not because they're looking for big, massive changes in the West Bank or an explosion in settlement construction or application of sovereignty to settlements, but because they were voting on law and order issues. Many Israelis are still very shell-shocked, literally and figuratively, by the events of May 2021, particularly the riots that broke out in mixed Israeli cities. And despite the fact that Itamar Ben-Gvir was blamed by the police commissioner at the time for instigating some of the violence in mixed cities, Itamar Ben-Gvir ran a very effective campaign where he said, "Vote for me, and effectively I'll restore order." And so there's plenty of evidence to suggest that what their voters want is law and order inside of Israel proper, inside the Green Line, and they're not nearly as interested in what happens in the West Bank. And so if that's the case, and these parties are responsive to their voters, understanding that the huge increase in their seats in the Knesset is because of the effective message that they crafted during the campaign, it's not necessarily a good thing for quiet between Israelis and Palestinians, especially given that a lot of this will involve changing the rules of engagement. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean changing things in the West Bank that really can't be undone. So I think that, that leads to the reasonable best case scenario of plenty of things happening that will cause friction with the United States and plenty of things that will cause friction with the Palestinians, but nothing that can necessarily be undone by a different government down the road. The worst case scenario is all of these things that Bezalel Smotrich in particular wants to do get carried out, and that it leads to the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. This is something that has been warned about for a long time, but I have to tell you, not only based on my own conversations with Israeli security officials, but based on my own experience in the West Bank in recent months, the Palestinian Authority has fundamentally lost control of much of the northern West Bank. In many places, they have chosen not to engage. At this point, in many ways, they effectively operate in and around Ramallah and have a token presence in other spots, but don't really have the power to enforce law and order. They're under enormous political strain, and I think it's very possible that many of these measures being contemplated will lead to the Palestinian Authority to collapse. And if that happens, what you're talking about is one of two scenarios. Either A, the IDF has to go back into all of the large Palestinian cities and towns, just to, sort of as a very quick refresher, the West Bank is divided into three areas A, B, and C. I already mentioned Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank and that is controlled entirely by Israel. Area A is 18% of the West Bank. It's the large Palestinian cities. And in Area A, the Palestinian Authority under Oslo has complete control, both security control and administrative control. Now, in practice, they don't actually have security control because the IDF makes about 600 raids into Area A each month. But in theory, Area A is supposed to be entirely under the PA control, and you have between 1.3 and 1.5 million Palestinians living in Area A. If the Palestinian Authority collapses, that means that Israel owns Area A. It will go in and literally be the day-to-day governor and mayor of Area A and all the cities in Area A. That means providing services to 1.3 million Palestinians. It means acting as traffic cops. It means dealing with all sorts of housing and construction and literally everything that municipal governments do that Israel has not done in Area A in almost 30 years, Israel will have to do. As it is right now, the standard is that 55% of all active duty IDF soldiers are stationed in the West Bank. That's in normal times. Since the spring, when Israel stepped up its operations in the West Bank, it's been about between 65 and 70% of IDF soldiers that are stationed in the West Bank full time. If the Palestinian Authority collapses, it's not hyperbole to say that every single active duty IDF soldier will have to be stationed in the West Bank just to run things, just to instate basic law and order. That means not having IDF soldiers on the border with Egypt, on the borders with Syria and Lebanon, doing routine training, all the things that an army has to do. It will effectively have turned into nothing but a full-time occupation force. And that's option A. Option B is that Israel elects not to do that. And then Hamas and Islamic Jihad step into the vacuum and they become the new government in the West Bank. And at that point, everything that you have in Gaza, you have in the West Bank, except for the fact that the West Bank is a much larger territory. It cannot be sealed off completely. And this is literally the nightmare scenario, not only for Israeli security officials, but for Israeli civilians. And that's the worst case scenario. And that's even before we talk about the impact that will have on terrorism and violence inside of Israeli cities inside the Green Line, let alone what happens in the West Bank. So, we're talking about a wide gap here between the best case and the worst case scenarios. But the worst case scenario is not a black swan. The worst case scenario, I think, has a frighteningly large chance of actually coming to fruition.
So I want to ask about the internet, some outside forces, I think, who feel they have a stake in this, although Israel might disagree. First is the international community, the US, the EU, the UN. Presumably they won't stand idly by from through a lot of these changes. What leverage do they have, and what do you expect the impact of them, acting to maintain the status quo?
I think that the US and the EU are going to have some pretty clear, very well defined red lines. I think it's reasonable to expect that the Biden administration and many members of Congress will put formal de jure annexation as a red line. The same goes for European countries. But certainly the Biden administration doesn't want to be in a position where they are getting into constant fights with the Israeli government. The administration rightly views Israel as an ally and an important partner. It wants to maintain military and security and intelligence cooperation with Israel in the region. All of those things benefit US foreign policy. And so this is not an administration, and certainly there isn't support in Congress for things like conditioning security assistance to Israel or placing new usage restrictions on the type of weapons that we sell to Israel. And so there isn't a huge amount of leverage in that department, certainly not the types of things that we often hear from the progressive side of the aisle that I think is going to be brought to bear. What I do think we're going to see, and this certainly does have, this certainly is a way of bringing leverage, bringing leverage to the situation with the Israeli government, are more diplomatic and political type measures. People remember the controversy that ensued in December 2016 at the United Nations when the Obama administration abstained from a Security Council resolution on Israeli settlements. I think that if some of these measures go ahead on the Israeli side, there's a good chance that we will see the United States once again abstain from some measures in the Security Council. At the moment, the Israeli government has been working very hard to get the United States to help with investigations into Israeli activity in the West Bank at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. I think that those sorts of things become a lot harder if Israel has fundamentally changed the status of the situation in the West Bank. I think that there are probably all sorts of trade relationships with the European Union that may be at risk. And so, these are all different ways in which the international community may be able to slow or even prevent some of the more far-ranging measures in the West Bank. Now, one big factor here is the other states in the region, the Abraham Accord states and states that may join the Abraham Accords in the future. And there's reason to think that they may act as a check on the Israeli government, A, given the popularity of normalization among Israelis, and B, given the fact that the UAE was the party that really stepped in and prevented annexation from taking place in summer of 2020. On that count, I'm actually not sure that the Abraham Accord states care as much or are going to bring as much pressure on the Israeli government as the United States or the European Union might. The UAE and Bahrain established normalized relations with Israel because it's very important to them bilaterally. Different reasons in different cases. With the UAE, it's much more about the trade and commercial relationship. With Bahrain, it's much more about the security relationship. Those factors aren't going to go away if Israel increases settlement activity in the West Bank, or if Israel applies sovereignty to settlements, or even if Israel annexes part of the West Bank. I think that there's a very strong logic to the relationships between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, and it's going to be very hard for those relationships to be derailed entirely. Certainly they can be strained, and I think they may be strained if some of these things happen, but I think those relationships are very robust and they're going to continue. It will make it much harder for other states to join the Abraham Accords because UAE and Bahrain, not that they were easy, but they presented cases in which you have, in the case of Bahrain, a pretty small state. In the case of the UAE, you have a state of 9 million people, only 1 million of whom are citizens. These are states where public opinion matters, but it doesn't matter as much as it does in a country like Saudi Arabia, where you have a population of, I think it's between 25 and 30 million. And they have to be much more attentive to the religious establishment. They have to be much more attentive to popular opinion. So these types of measures that really put Palestinian sovereignty and independence out of reach, and that make a two-state outcome more or less impossible down the road, I think that those types of things will make it equally impossible for countries like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Kuwait, some of the countries that have been mentioned at the top of the list in terms of who Israel would like to see normalize relations. I think it makes normalizing relations with those countries very, very difficult, if not impossible. And it's possible that Netanyahu will use that also as a way to try and appeal to some of his coalition partners, given that normalization is very high on his own personal agenda.
Another outside, I'll say partner, not interest, but partner, is a diaspora Jewry. There's I think a minority of, according to polls, a minority of American Jewry supports the right-wing government. I think the much larger, and that's a small but very vocal minority. The larger majority, I guess, would support more of a two-state solution. They want to see what, they connect to Israel through what they see as a shared sense of democracy. Have you given thought to does Netanyahu and his coalition partners think at all about them and their concerns, the connection with the diaspora? And do they have any leverage at all in terms of moderating any of these countervailing trends?
The short answer is not really. The parties in the prospective coalition are not ones that historically have cared very much about the relationship with diaspora Jewry. The Haredi parties care about the relationship with Haredi Jews in diaspora, but Haredi Jews in diaspora are not the ones who are concerned about the erosion of liberal values inside of Israel or the situation in the West Bank for the most part. And parties like Religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit really don't care what liberal American Jewry thinks about much of anything. We've already seen some of the demands in some of these coalition agreements have been to amend the law of return, where right now anybody who has one Jewish grandparent is eligible to be an Israeli citizen under the law of return. These parties have been requesting that it be amended so that you are only eligible if you are halachically Jewish, meaning Jewish mother. So I think that gives some sense of how they view diaspora concerns, because this is obviously something that is a great concern, I think, to many diaspora Jews in North America and elsewhere. Within Likud, there has historically been an appreciation for diaspora Jewry, and particularly North American Jewry, as a real asset to the state of Israel, given the role that North American Jewry has had traditionally in supporting the state economically and politically. I think that has changed a bit over time, and something that we've seen from people in Netanyahu's circle over the past decade and a half has been repeated comments about how within the US context, it's more important to be making inroads with evangelical Christians than with North American Jews, given the politics of evangelical Christians and given their size. It's interesting when you look at polling of evangelicals, what you see is that evangelicals under the age of 40 do not support Israel in the same numbers that evangelicals over the age of 40 do. So I think that over time, that strategy is going to end up being somewhat disappointing to folks in the Likud as well. But their priority has been more about finding supporters in the United States who are sympathetic to them politically, as opposed to trying to bring American Jews around to their side of things. So, among the among the list of difficulties to add on to, what has already been a depressing conversation, I think that we are in for a tough time in terms of diaspora-Israel relations as well. It's not just about the issues that have been on the table over the past few years that have been disappointing to diaspora Jewry, whether it be the Western Wall arrangement, whether it be recognition of conservative and reform Judaism inside of Israel, whether it be things like the law of return, which now seems to be under threat. I think that in general, this question of values, which has been a big deal, is going to be even more front and center, because the reality of the situation is that many American Jews have looked at Israel and thought of it as a place that has these shared liberal values with the United States. To some extent, that's been historically accurate. I think to other extents it hasn't been. But that picture, whether it's accurate or not, is going to be under incredible strain. And I think that even if you leave aside the impact of policies this government might undertake that impact diaspora Jews directly, it's going to be difficult for many diaspora Jews, particularly in North America, to look at some of the things happening in Israel, even if they don't impact the lives of diaspora Jews at all. I think it's going to be difficult to see many of these things and identify with Israel in the same manner to which diaspora Jewry has traditionally identified with Israel.
Right. And this is obviously an important question for our I think our audience here, which is very strongly supportive of the Masorti movement in Israel, and clearly would be counted among the group that wants to see Israel to become a more pluralistic country religiously. I want to ask a couple of questions that have come to us from the audience, which you can drop into chat, by the way. I'll get to as many as I can, but this is actually a good follow-up to what we were saying about the countervailing forces from, the international community. Someone asked, are there any countervailing powers that might moderate the far right within Israeli society? And by that, the person means professional military leadership, major business leaders, other, opinion makers who might have, outside of the political process, influence on what happens in the government.
So I'll start with the IDF and security leaders. Thankfully, there is no history of IDF leadership interfering in the political decisions of elected civilian leaders in Israel, and I hope that will continue. The way the security establishment has generally dealt with these sorts of things is by presenting a united front when they speak to the political leadership and give their opinions and advice and warnings about what might happen. They tend to be very savvy at leaking those opinions to the media when they think that their concerns are being ignored. I'm certain that sort of thing will continue. We already saw some discord over the past week between IDF leadership and some of the members of the prospective new coalition over disciplinary measures that were taken against soldiers who were serving in Hebron. One of whom punched a protester, another of whom verbally assaulted a protester, and that caused angst among some of the members of the new coalition. And we saw some public sniping back and forth between the military leadership and politicians. And the more that happens, I think the more. Over time, I'm not sure that it's the IDF military leadership that loses that battle. I think it's probably the politicians that lose that battle over time. And so, that can be a moderating influence, but I absolutely do not expect to see the military leadership stepping in any way and preventing something that the government may want to do. The biggest check will be Israelis themselves. There was, something else interesting that happened this week, which was that Avi Maoz, who is the single member of Knesset from Noam, which is one of these three very radical right-wing parties. Avi Maoz was appointed as a deputy minister in the prime minister's office, and he was given control over effectively everything that is not part of the core curriculum in Israeli schools. So anything that isn't math, science, English, anything else sort of any curriculum that has to do with culture, with Jewish identity. Avi Maoz was given. It's actually a budget of 2 billion shekel, and there was literally a revolt from Israeli mayors. You had over 100, the mayors of over 100 municipalities signing a letter saying that they are not going to be bound by Avi Maoz's dictates on curriculum, and that they are going to keep on funding their curriculum themselves. And there was a huge outcry, and this included in right-wing cities and right-wing mayors, including Likud mayors as well. Now, we'll see what actually happens when the government takes power, if this is effective and if it actually has an impact on the curriculum inside of Israeli schools. But I think that the most effective check is going to be government overreach, which leads to a backlash among Israeli citizens and among Israeli politicians who are not members of Knesset. Gadi Eisenkot, who is the most recent former IDF chief of staff, who's a member of the National Unity Party, Hamachaneh Hamamlachti in Hebrew, that's Benny Gantz's party. He talked last week about getting 1 million people into the streets protesting if Israeli democracy is undermined, and said that he would be at the forefront of leading those protests. And I think that type of thing will be the most effective check on some of the excesses of the new Israeli government.
Great, thank you. Switching gears a little, someone is asking a question about Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the PA. She asks, are there any Palestinian leaders in training who'd be ready to take over the PA if Mahmoud Abbas leaves? And under what conditions might he resign or be removed from the PA leadership?
There are no conditions in which he will resign. There are no conditions in which he will be removed. He will leave the PA presidency in a coffin, whenever that is. He turned 87 a few weeks ago. His father lived, nobody knows for sure, but his father lived either until 103 or 105. So Mahmoud Abbas may be with us quite a great deal longer. But what he has been doing has been setting up 2 people to take over when he is gone. One is a guy named Hussein Al-Sheikh, who is he's a minister. He's the minister for civil affairs in the Palestinian Authority, but he effectively controls almost everything at this point. And the other is Majid Faraj, who is the head of Palestinian General Intelligence. He has placed the 2 of them, but particularly Hussein Al-Sheikh, as the people who will take over after him. Whether that will hold after he's gone, I think is a real open question. There's a lot of resentment among other Palestinian leaders toward both of them, a lot of opposition to the idea that Abbas can just anoint a successor in that way, particularly outside of any sort of consultative or democratic process. But that's who he is positioned to take over after he goes. I don't think it will be quite that simple. As I said, they aren't popular among other Palestinian leaders. Neither of them has a huge following among the Palestinian public either. Majid Faraj is somebody who kind of operates behind the scenes, is not at all a politician. And Hussein Al-Sheikh, among corrupt Palestinian leadership, may be the most corrupt of all of them. So he's not particularly popular among ordinary Palestinians. So I think it's likelier to be messy than it is to just have somebody step in, and have a seamless transition.
Mm-hmm. Another question we have is about Israel's energy resources. Does Israel have any leverage over Europe? Because of, I guess we're talking about some of the natural gas finds and all that. And with the European need for energy, and I'm guessing in the wake of the Ukraine war, have any impact on their relationships with Israel?
Israel doesn't really have any leverage over the Europeans. First of all, the Israeli gas fields are not big enough to make a huge dent in European supply. Second of all, at the moment, there's no way of actually getting the gas there. There are talks about building a pipeline. There have been talks about liquefying the gas at different LNG terminals. Israel doesn't have an LNG terminal, but Egypt does. Although, from what I understand, it may not be compatible with the Israeli gas, so you'd have to retrofit it. It's not as easy as sort of just saying we have gas, hey, Europeans, buy it. As I said, there are plans in the works to build a pipeline. There was a plan to build a pipeline in conjunction with Greece and Cyprus through Greek and Cypriot waters. That was deemed to be not economically viable. And in fact, the United States a few months ago came out and itself said it didn't deem that plan to be economically viable. There are new discussions now to build a pipeline via Turkey. And this is part of what's behind the improved relations between Israel and Turkey over the past year. But again, this is a longer term project. So, Israeli gas over the next few years may be able to help the Europeans somewhat, but not in any way that it really gives Israel much leverage over Europe. In terms of the Ukraine-Russia angle, that's not a spot where I think Israel has necessarily been doing itself favors in terms of relations with Europe. Israel has been straddling this line between Russia and Ukraine, largely over the fact that Russia still has a pretty strong military presence in Syria. Israel wants to preserve its freedom of action in the Syrian skies to be able to hit Iranian targets. Both planes coming from Iran that tend to land in the Damascus airport and also land-based convoys, which the Iranians have been using increasingly in recent months to funnel weapons to Hezbollah. Israel wants to be able to hit those, which it has been doing. That means maintaining good relations with Russia to make sure that Russia doesn't either shoot at Israeli planes or prevent them from entering Syrian airspace. And so, for that reason, primarily, Israel has been very careful about how much it assists Ukraine. It's been sending non-lethal defensive help, so things like flak jackets and helmets. So far, it has held off on providing Ukraine with any type of real weapons. I think that that's likely to continue. I think all the more so it's likely to continue under this new government, given that Netanyahu is the person who, during his previous 12 years, really worked hard to develop strong relations with Putin, and I don't think that's something Netanyahu wants to put at risk. So I think that the Europeans have been in different ways cajoling the Israelis to get in the game a bit more. I don't think it's going to be successful, and so that's not really an area where Israeli policy is going to help them with the Europeans.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, as we come to the end of the hour, I wanted to ask you if you had any questions or just something we haven't touched upon that you wanted to make sure we cover.
We've covered a lot here, so there's not a lot. The one thing I would say is it's really important that people don't look at what's taking place in Israel, throw up their hands and say, there's nothing we can do to change this, and Israelis are increasingly uninterested in what we think, and so we're going to disengage. To my mind, the relationship that American Jews have to Israel is too important to just throw up our hands and say it doesn't matter. I think that for many American Jews, not for people at Beth Shalom, because this is a very strong shul and a very strong community. But for many American Jews, their Jewish identity boils down to little more than Israel. And if we turn our backs on this relationship with Israel, I worry not only what it means for our Zionism, and I worry about what it means for our personal relationships with Israel. I really worry what it means for American Jewish identity writ large, and American Jews as a collective. For better or for worse, American Jewish leaders 7 decades ago decided to throw in their lot with Zionism and really turn American Jewish identity in many ways as revolving around Zionism. And I say for better or for worse because in light of how the relationship has developed, maybe that wasn't such a smart move. Maybe American Jewish identity should have remained Zionist but been really built on other foundations. But for many American Jews, it really is about Israel and Zionism. And I think that if we take American Jewish identity seriously and we take the American Jewish Project seriously, we have to think about two things. A, how we build an American Jewish identity that's uniquely American. But second, how we preserve some sort of relationship with Israel, even when we see things coming from Israel, the Israeli government and Israeli society that we don't like, that we don't identify with, that don't speak to our Jewish values. We're living in a time where we have an independent Jewish state with Jewish sovereignty in the Jewish homeland. This is a historical anomaly. This almost never happens in the context of Jewish history. And I think that to turn our backs on that, despite all of the difficulties, really would be a tragedy in the scope of Jewish history. And I worry that it will be catastrophic for American Jewish identity. So, I'd urge everybody here, if you like what you see going on in Israel, great, you've got no problems. If you don't like what you see going on in Israel, try to figure out what your relationship with Israel will look like and how to have a productive one. And that doesn't have to mean supporting everything the Israeli government does. I consider myself, somebody who is a strong Zionist, strongly pro-Israel. It's a place that I love. I agree with almost nothing that I'm going to see from this Israeli government, and I support almost none of it. But I'm still able to have a strong, meaningful relationship with the state of Israel, and I hope that people are able to do the same, irrespective of the day-to-day of Israeli politics.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. That was a great note to end on, and I appreciate it. I want to thank you for taking part in this and enlightening us on the situation in Israel. And I want to thank Eric and the Ein L'Tzion committee for the opportunity. I think Eric's going to come back and say a few words before we sign off. But once again, thank you, Michael, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure.
That sounds like a great idea. Michael, to say that we've covered a lot is an understatement. Thank you very much once again for your informed, balanced, and erudite assessments. All of us, as you said, including Israelis, are trying to make sense out of this. And you are a very much needed voice in our understanding of the current and still changing situation and its complexities. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for your expertise, skill, and willingness to moderate our session tonight, making it even more meaningful. Thank you, Abby Rosenfinkel, Beth Shalom Synagogue Administrator, for hosting our Zoom and creating all the publicity related to this evening. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. You can continue to follow Michael and his colleagues on their website, israelpolicyforum.org. So Erev Tov, everybody. Have a good evening. Thanks, everybody. Andrew, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Hi. Thank you, Eric, for moderating. And Andrew as well. Thank you for bringing it together.
Great to have seen you all, almost.